Hi, it's me, Marcia. So I want to talk about my final paper entitled In Presence of an Absence: Negation as a Means of Revisionist History in Kincaid's Autobiography of My Mother. So this paper is ultimately an attempt to understand whether or not it is possible for Suella, the main character, to receive agency. And the look at agency is, as my title suggests, um, viewed in terms of Suella's relationship to her mother and her embodiment of her mother's narrative, because the book is entitled The Autobiography of My Mother, which suggests that in some way she is reenacting the narrative of her mother, and as well as the narrative of the colonized people whom her mother represents. And this act becomes one that ultimately transcends her entire life. And the claim for this book to be the autobiography of my mother also ultimately claims that Suella is dead. Because in her mother being dead and her receiving the status of non-existence, she too only finds rise to validity in death, a thing which becomes very problematic because she only loves people once they are dead. And I go about this in a very um, interesting way in that I begin with the idea of Suella's narrative being a Bildungsraum, which I ultimately come to the conclusion that it cannot be, because ultimately the end of the journey of the Bildungsraum is usually a claim to adulthood, because it's this type of a coming of age story. And this can't happen because at the end she ultimately doesn't achieve agency. The only agency that she ever obtains is death, and death becomes the ultimate claim to universal. A universal which isn't even universal in the sense that the term human is, because human is a type of universal that people can claim, but even this universal isn't fully capable of granting an individual agency, because human doesn't consider the particulars of human existence. I mean, it doesn't consider the relationship between individuals. It doesn't take into consideration that somebody who is um, black or Native American or any other race than what is considered to be normative is placed directly into question by the act of not being these things. Thus, the claim to universality doesn't take into consideration all of the individual particulars. And this ignorance of the individual particulars is most clear in her relationship or attempts to achieve third space, which, while she does receive a claim to third space, or as Homi Bhabha claims it, an individual identity, one independent of the relationship to economic, financial, social, or political life, it seems like there is something necessary in these characteristics of um, social, economic, and political life that the third space doesn't grant the agency for, because there's ultimately not even a language for it, which is portrayed in her need to express her identity in terms of these negations, which is so problematic because that means that there's no language in which she's capable of expressing her identity. And she also doesn't have anything to ground her identity in, which would grant validity or would give her rights similar to those of the colonizer. And this act of it being a negation between ideas is what creates her character, but also makes her seem somehow inhuman because she has so much resilience. her character becomes unreal, dead, and this act of it being dead is transcendent of the possibility of creating an agent within life that is not tragic, because her tragic identity or her ultimate return to death as the ultimate claim becomes sort of like Antigone in Sophocles' Antigone. There's this claim to death as being the only way in which she's capable of talking against the empire, or in the case of Antigone, burying her brother's body. So it's a type of an agency, but it's not necessarily a recognized agency until death. And this act of the individual who claims it having to be dead is the ultimate problematizer, in that it ensures that even though she's setting up the possibility for agency in the future, she herself cannot have agency. And I look at her attempt and her rationalization with death in terms of her relationship with different individuals within her life. And I begin by looking at the relationship between Suella and her mother, to establish what paints her as a victim and how idealization and death lead to dissatisfaction and ultimately emptiness, and how this gap created by her mother transcends the entirety of the novel. Furthermore, I look at the relationship with her father, which is almost the antithesis of her relationship with her mother, but also begins within a state of idealization. But loses that idealization as soon as he becomes a reality. And through her father, she's then able to realize the problems in the relationship between the colonized and the colonizer, which are portrayed as a family conflict between her mother and her father. And this is ultimately then further complicated with the relationship of the brother, who becomes a manifestation of her father, in that her brother is the inheritance of her father in the same way that she is the inheritance of her mother. But the fact is that her brother is, like the majority of American citizens, unaware of his claim to agency, and therein is not able to enact it. He, just because one has the right to vote, individuals who have the right to vote tend not to vote, even if they have a right or claim to agency. And this becomes then her brother. But she also recognizes this, and in death he joins her and her mother, and she grows to see him as real only once he's dead, which manifests the relationship between death and living, and the ways in which death is the only possibility for her to love something, because life is problematic, and it's not granted equally to all. Death is granted equally to all. Next, we look at the sexual partners who place into question her womanhood and her relationship with love, which she finds, like herself, undefinable, as well as her desires for independence above all else, and her ultimate choice to end this narrative of submission and destruction in her claim to her body, the only true claim to herself that she can make, the third space that she creates, not as an external but as an internal claim to her body and a claim to her mother's narrative, ensuring that there will never be another Suella. There cannot be another Suella, at least within the history of the family, and in therein she's capable of rewriting her mother's narrative. But the claim to agency of her own narrative is therein severely parsed. Next, I look at the strange attachment to her adoptive mothers, or the a motherly love that she seeks, which she's never capable of fully obtaining, and this hatred and love relationship which he has in with all these three women within the novel, and this relationship becomes very, very tight relationships in which it seems very much more intimate even than any of the relationships which she has with any of the men. And this makes it clear that there's somehow something that she's missing from that might have allowed her to go through um, this narrative of the Bildungsraum that is somehow not possible. Um, and none of these individuals provide her with like a self-confirmation of her identity. Her identity is not recognized by any of these women. And therein she's somehow not real. She becomes not real. At some point she looks at some other people and say they're real. I'm not real. She looks at her sister and she's like, I suddenly knew what a real child would do. And this claim to realness is almost ensures her status as non-real. She is not an accepted entity. She is not a political agent. She is non-existent by the standards of the state. She becomes void and non-existent. The only thing upon which her existence might depend on is death. She knows that death is the ultimate determiner, but not even life is the determiner. She could have claimed we are all human, but she doesn't. She claims that death is equal to all, and hence that's embodied within her love for death itself. In the same way as Antigone loves death, because death is the ultimate. It becomes the concluding factor within all life, and the only possible thing which can grant agency to her, and which can ultimately fulfill the narrative. Um, Finally, I look at the relationship with the community, which is so important in that the community takes on the same beliefs as the colonizer, and in that way, it begins to question itself and to fall apart on itself because it questions its own agency as a community, because the definition of membership has been destroyed by these ideals that have been placed on them through the colonizer. So they themselves are falling apart because there's no membership is no longer grants them agency because this membership is placed directly into question by these new ideals that are being brought in by the colonizer. And agency is rooted like if the father chooses to take on these positions and the King of England and all of that leads to this desire to receive agency, and the only way to receive it is by taking on the language of the colonizer, which Suella refuses, and therein refuses to take agency. But she does, in the act of not taking on the language of the colonizer, has still a claim to her identity, which, to a degree, individuals who choose to take on the narrative of the colonizer do not. So to conclude my speech on my final paper, I would like to say that it was really, really interesting to look at what comprises and makes up the human political animal and how agency is ultimately not constructed by the individual but by external forces, and that citizenship at its most basic is something that is determined by membership. And membership is determined by the individual who is at the top. And history is created by whoever is on the top. But individuals can make their own history. That's what I learned. So, yeah, see ya if I do pass.